At 7:42 on the morning of March 14th, 1941, Beatrice Shilling stood on the rain-darkened tarmac at RAF Kinley, watching a Hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit for what might be his last flight. She was 32 years old, 6 years into her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and so far, she had failed to solve the problem that was killing Britain's pilots. The Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf 109s across the Channel that week alone. RAF squadrons had met them in 27 separate engagements. 14 Hurricanes were lost, 9 Spitfires destroyed. The reports all told the same story. A British pilot spots a German fighter, pushes the nose down to attack. The engine cuts out. For 1.5 seconds. That was all it took. Fuel flooded the carburetor during -G maneuvers. The float chamber surged. The jet starved. The Rolls-Royce Merlin went silent just long enough for a Messerschmitt to close 300 yards and open fire. British pilots fought desperately to restart their engines, while German fighters circled back and finished them. The Germans didn't suffer this problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. No float chamber. No flooding. No hesitation. Bf 109 pilots could dive, roll, invert, and climb without losing power for even a heartbeat. They exploited it mercilessly. Shilling had read the combat reports, studied the maintenance logs, interviewed pilots who survived by luck alone. Squadron commanders were begging for a fix. The RAF was bleeding experienced airmen faster than training schools could replace them, and the proper solution wasn't coming in time. Rolls-Royce engineers were working on a pressure carburetor, a full redesign of the fuel system. It would work, but it wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe 1944. The war wouldn't wait that long. Neither could the pilots climbing into their aircraft every morning knowing their own engines might betray them before the enemy ever fired a shot. Squadron leader Davies walked past Shilling toward his Hurricane. 24 years old. 41 combat missions. 3 confirmed kills. He had reported engine failure twice in the past month. Both times during combat dives. Both times he survived by instinct, training, and luck. He nodded to Shilling as he passed. She nodded back. He didn't know she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough. To him, she was probably just another civilian on the airfield. Someone with a clipboard. Someone powerless. What he didn't know was that Shilling had brought something with her to Kinley that morning. Inside her leather satchel was a small brass component, precisely machined, almost absurdly simple. Her team had tested it on a bench engine for 6 weeks. It worked, but bench tests weren't combat. Combat was 300 miles an hour. Combat was -G forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death measured in seconds. Shilling walked toward her Norton motorcycle. If she was wrong, pilots would keep dying. If she was right, she could change the air war. By noon, she would know which. Beatrice Shilling joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, 1 month after Britain declared war. She was one of only 2 women in the engine department. The other was a secretary. Shilling was the principal technical officer responsible for carburetor research and development. Most of the men she worked with had never taken orders from a female engineer. Some didn't believe women belonged in engineering at all. Shilling didn't care what they believed. She cared about keeping pilots alive. She had grown up around engines. At 14, she bought her first motorcycle, a battered Norton, and tore its 2-stroke engine down to individual components. She learned how every part worked, why each failure happened, and how small changes could mean the difference between power and silence. At 25, she raced that same Norton at Brooklands, averaging 106 miles per hour, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star. Only 3 women in history had ever earned it. Shilling was the second. Racing taught her something textbooks never could: how engines fail under stress. High G turns, sudden acceleration, fuel starvation, flooding, mechanical hesitation that happens before any gauge reacts. She learned to feel what an engine needed before it asked. That intuition made her the best carburetor specialist in Britain. And now, British pilots were dying because their engines couldn't handle the stress of combat. The solution came to her in January 1941. It wasn't complicated. It was physics. The float chamber flooded because fuel could surge freely when gravity reversed. During -G maneuvers, fuel overwhelmed the jet and drowned the engine. So what if fuel flow wasn't unrestricted? Not shut off, just limited. Enough to prevent flooding without starving the engine. The answer was almost insulting in its simplicity. A brass disc. One precisely calculated hole in the center. Installed in the fuel line just before the carburetor. It would cap maximum fuel flow slightly below what the engine demanded at full throttle. Enough to keep combustion stable when gravity went upside down. Shilling machined the first prototype herself. Brass. Thimble-shaped. 1/8 of an inch across. The hole measured exactly 0.040 inches. Those numbers mattered. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve under full power. She tested 17 different sizes before finding the balance. Then she simplified it. A flat washer. Easier to produce. Easier to install. Easier to replace. Bench tests showed it worked. Simulated -G conditions no longer flooded the carburetor. The engine never cut out. But bench tests weren't combat. Combat meant real aircraft. Real pilots. Real consequences. And permission was the problem. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters violated dozens of regulations. If the restrictor failed and a pilot died, Shilling would face court-martial, possibly prison. She decided not to ask. She would install it first and answer questions later. That morning at RAF Kenley, she carried 6 restrictors in her satchel and one ally. Sergeant William Cooper. Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years. He had watched 19 pilots die from engine failures. He didn't ask questions when Shilling showed him the brass washer. He simply nodded and reached for his tools. The Hurricane sat on its dispersal pad. Pilot strapped in. Engine warming. 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked fast. Fuel line disconnected. Restrictor slid into place. A quick weld with a butane torch. 60 seconds. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Shilling inspected the weld. Clean. Solid. Perfect. Squadron Leader Davies would fly with the modification. He didn't know it was there. She hadn't told him. Hadn't told the squadron commander. Hadn't told anyone except Cooper. If it failed, there would be no paperwork. No authorization. No record. Just a dead pilot. And a piece of brass that shouldn't have existed. The Merlin roared to full power. Davies ran his checks. Oil pressure steady. Coolant normal. All 12 cylinders firing. He released the brakes. The Hurricane surged forward, lifted cleanly into the air, and climbed. Shilling raised her binoculars. 800 feet. 1,200. 2,000. The aircraft banked south toward the channel. She watched as 2 more Hurricanes joined him, a standard section of 3, climbing toward 15,000 feet. They turned toward Dungeness. German fighters had been active there all week. Now all Shilling could do was wait. If Davies encountered a Messerschmitt, he would have to dive. And when he did, the restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. There would be no second chances. Shilling waited on the tarmac. Sergeant Cooper stood beside her. Neither spoke. Around them, RAF Kenley carried on as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Ground crews fueled Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. Mechanics shouted over the roar of warming engines. A fuel truck rattled past, tires crunching on gravel. Shilling heard none of it. Her mind was locked on numbers. A 0.040 inch aperture. Maximum fuel flow at full throttle. -G duration, 1.5 seconds. The mathematics were sound. But mathematics wasn't combat. 40 minutes passed. Then an hour. Radio silence. That could mean anything. No enemy contact. Or a dogfight so violent there was no time to report. Or Davies was dead. His Hurricane scattered across a French field, the restrictor buried in wreckage that would never be examined. At 9:37, the radio crackled. 3 Hurricanes inbound. 2 minutes out. Shilling lifted her binoculars. She saw them immediately. 3 dark shapes against the pale morning sky. All 3 aircraft. No losses. The Hurricanes entered the circuit. Davies landed first. He taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, and climbed down from the cockpit. Shilling walked toward him. Her hands were shaking. She had designed engines. She had tested systems under controlled conditions. She had never done this. Never installed an unauthorized modification and sent a man into combat to see if her idea would keep him alive. Davies pulled off his helmet. He was smiling. That was wrong. Pilots didn't smile after patrols. They usually looked hollow, drained, older than they were when they took off. Davies looked exhilarated. Cooper asked first. Any problems with the engines, sir? Davies looked at Cooper, then at Shilling, then back again. Best the Merlins ever run, he said. Dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat. Shilling asked him to describe everything. Exactly what happened. Davies had spotted 2 Bf-109s at 14,000 feet, heading east toward France. He climbed above them, altitude advantage, then pushed into a steep dive. For 100 miles per hour. -G strong enough to lift him against his harness. The dive that had killed engines for 11 months. But the Merlin kept running. Full power. No hesitation. No cough. He closed to 200 yards before the German pilot even knew he was there. Fired a 3-second burst. Saw strikes tear through the Messerschmitt's left wing root. The German broke hard right and fled for the channel. Davies pulled up, climbed back to altitude. The engine never faltered. It was the first time in nearly a year he had completed a diving attack without losing power. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his aircraft. Shilling told him. The restrictor. The brass washer. The controlled fuel flow. Davies stared at her for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Cooper. Put that thing in every hurricane on this station, he said. Today. Shilling told him it wasn't authorized. Davies didn't care. He cared about surviving. Every pilot at Kinley had lost friends to engine failures. 19 men dead in 6 months, not shot down, but betrayed by their own engines. Davies said if the Air Ministry wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed engines that worked. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more hurricanes that afternoon. Shilling had brought 6. She kept 1 for testing. 5 hurricanes flew combat patrols with restrictors over the next 3 days. 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks pressed successfully against German fighters. Pilots reported their Merlins ran flawlessly, better than ever. Some claimed improved performance at altitude. Word spread fast. By March 18th, every squadron commander in No. 11 group knew about the restrictor. They wanted it. Immediately. Shilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days. Could she come to their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? The Royal Air Force had been bleeding pilots for 11 months, and a brass washer had just stopped it. The question wasn't whether it worked anymore. The question was how fast it could be deployed. Shilling had machined 6 restrictors herself in the Royal Aircraft Establishment Workshop. That was enough to prove the idea. It wasn't enough to save the Royal Air Force. Thousands of Merlin engines needed the modification. Every Hurricane, every Spitfire, every operational aircraft, every reserve, every training unit. That meant production. Real production. Proper brass stock. Precision machining. Quality control measured in thousandths of an inch. A single bad restrictor could starve an engine at altitude and kill a pilot just as surely as the original flaw. Shilling needed Air Ministry approval. She needed funding. She needed time. She got approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal with a speed normally reserved for aircraft production itself. The paperwork labeled it plainly, an operationally decisive modification. Rolls-Royce received the manufacturing contract. They could produce 500 restrictors per week. Installation would begin immediately at every fighter station in Britain. Shilling assembled a small field team, 3 engineers from Farnborough and 2 civilian mechanics. Their mission was simple: move fast, supervise installations, and keep aircraft flying. The restrictor could be fitted without removing an aircraft from service. That mattered more than anything. The Battle of Britain was officially over, but the war in the air wasn't. German fighters still crossed the Channel daily. Fighter Command could not afford to ground squadrons, even briefly. Shilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools, blueprints, and crates of brass washers. She knew the roads. She had visited 43 RAF stations before the war. She knew the commanding officers, the maintenance chiefs, the dispersal layouts. She knew how fighter bases worked when men were dying every week. Now she was coming back with something that would stop it. By March 25th, the teams were ready. 600 restrictors completed. 40 stations on the schedule. Nearly 3,000 Merlin engines waiting. Shilling started her Norton and rode north toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill was the heart of No. 11 Group. 32 Spitfires. 21 Hurricanes. For squadrons rotating through continuous combat operations. She arrived at 8 o'clock on March 26th. Group Captain Grice met her at the gate. He had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in 2 months. He didn't ask for a briefing. He ordered the installations to begin immediately. Ground crews worked in shifts, for aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect the fuel line. Weld the restrictor into place. Reconnect. Pressure test. Inspect. The welds had to be flawless. A bad joint at altitude could starve an engine completely. Shilling supervised every installation herself. She inspected every weld. She rejected 3 restrictors that didn't meet tolerance. Pilots watched closely. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, 41 combat missions, had suffered engine failure twice, both during critical moments in dogfights. He asked how something so simple could fix a problem that had killed so many. Shilling explained the physics. Fuel inertia, flow chamber behavior, negative G conditions. Lacey understood immediately. He had studied engineering at Cambridge. Brilliant, he said, because it doesn't fight the carburetor. It limits it. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Shilling moved on. Hornchurch, North Weald, Tangmere. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. Ground crews worked 12-hour shifts. Pilots flew patrols with modified engines. 0 failures. Not one. The restrictor worked exactly as designed. The pilots gave it a name. They called it Miss Shilling's Orifice. The nickname came from Sir Stanley Hooker at Rolls-Royce. Crude, unapologetic RAF humor. Shilling didn't mind. She had spent 6 years working with pilots and mechanics. She understood how men living under constant threat process stress. If an off-color joke helped them remember the modification, she'd accept it. The name spread faster than the part itself. By April, every fighter pilot in Britain knew it by name. Some refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had it installed. Squadron commanders backed them. They had buried too many men already. German intelligence noticed. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April noted a change. RAF fighters no longer broke off diving attacks. British pilots pressed negative G maneuvers without hesitation. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the Merlin's weakness. The advantage was gone. By mid-April, Shilling's teams had installed restrictors in over 2,100 Merlin engines. Every Hurricane, every Spitfire, every operational unit, every reserve aircraft. A fatal flaw that had plagued British fighters for 11 months had been eliminated, not with a redesign, not with new engines, but with a brass washer. And for the first time since the Battle of Britain began, RAF pilots entered combat knowing their own engines would not betray them. The modification became standard equipment almost overnight. New Spitfires and Hurricanes rolling off the production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton now carried the restrictor before they ever touched a runway. What had started as an unauthorized experiment on a rain-soaked dispersal pad was quietly becoming doctrine. The pressure carburetor, the true, permanent solution, was still under development. Rolls-Royce engineers estimated it would not be ready for operational use until 1943. But Shilling's tiny brass washer worked so well that some engineers began asking an uncomfortable question. Why redesign an entire fuel system when a 50-cent piece of brass had solved the problem? Shilling knew the answer immediately. The restrictor was brilliant, but it was a stopgap. It limited fuel flow to prevent flooding, but it also capped maximum engine performance under certain conditions. The pressure carburetor would eliminate the problem entirely. No float chamber, no starvation, no power loss. Full performance under any attitude, any maneuver. That was real engineering. But wars are not fought on perfect timelines. Until the pressure carburetor arrived, Miss Shilling's Orifice would keep pilots alive. And that was enough. The results were undeniable. Fighter Command tracked combat data obsessively. Every sortie, every engagement, every loss. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF pilots reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks. Pilots broke off engagements. German fighters escaped. Worse still, Luftwaffe pilots learned to exploit the weakness, baiting British fighters into negative G dives they knew would kill the Merlin. In April, after the restrictor was installed, engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0%. Almost none. The few failures that did occur were unrelated, battle damage, mechanical wear, the ordinary costs of war. The kill-to-loss ratio shifted immediately. March had been grim. 47 RAF fighters lost. 61 German aircraft destroyed. Barely breaking even. April told a different story. 29 RAF fighters lost. 94 German aircraft destroyed. More than 3-1. The restrictor was not the only reason, but squadron commanders across fighter command credited it as decisive. More than numbers changed. Confidence returned. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, flying Spitfires out of Duxford, had suffered engine failures 4 times before the restrictor. After it was installed, he stopped hesitating. He pressed attacks aggressively. In May and June, he destroyed 5 Bf-109s. He credited the restrictor not with horsepower, but with trust. He could commit without fear. Demand spread rapidly beyond fighter command. Coastal Command requested restrictors for their Beaufighters. Bomber Command wanted them installed on training aircraft. The Fleet Air Arm asked about carrier-based fighters. Shilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce as manufacturing scaled up to 1,000 restrictors per week. The device remained in frontline service through 1943. When the pressure carburetor finally entered production in January of that year, it performed exactly as promised. But converting existing aircraft required hours of labor. New pumps, rewired controls, grounded aircraft. Fighter Command could not afford the downtime. So many squadrons kept the restrictor. Some aircraft flew with Miss Shilling's orifice until 1944. A few carried it until the war's end. Pilots trusted it. Ground crews understood it. And in wartime, reliability mattered more than elegance. Shilling moved on. She worked on cold weather starting systems for operations in Iceland and the Soviet Union. She studied high-altitude fuel mixture problems. She contributed to improved supercharger designs for late-war Merlin engines. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her busy solving problems most people would never hear about. But thousands of pilots owed their lives to a solution so small it could fit in the palm of a hand. A brass washer, a forbidden modification, and one engineer who refused to accept that nothing could be done. But it was the restrictor that made Beatrice Shilling's name immortal. Pilots remembered it long after the war. Engineers studied it. Aviation schools taught it as a textbook example of perfect wartime engineering. A simple idea, applied immediately, producing measurable, life-saving results under extreme pressure. Everything good engineering was supposed to be. Years later, Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, summed it up bluntly. Beatrice Shilling helped us win the war. Of that, there is no doubt. Miss Shilling's orifice wasn't glamorous. It didn't roar like an engine or shine like a new aircraft. It was a piece of brass smaller than a coin. But it changed the balance of air combat at the exact moment Britain needed it most. It kept pilots alive long enough to gain experience. It gave them confidence to press attacks instead of breaking away. It turned survival into superiority. And yet, for Shilling, it was only one solution among many. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the war never slowed. One crisis replaced another. Engines failed at high altitude. Fuel systems iced over in extreme cold. Aircraft refused to start in Arctic conditions. Every failure meant dead pilots, lost aircraft, and weakened squadrons. And every one of those problems eventually landed on Beatrice Shilling's desk. When Spitfires were deployed to Murmansk in late 1941, British pilots encountered a new enemy. Cold so extreme it broke machines before combat even began. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Engine oil turned to sludge. Batteries died overnight. Fuel lines froze solid. Soviet ground crews had never worked with Merlin engines and had no manuals, no spare parts, no experience. Shilling designed a cold start procedure that combined preheated oil systems with modified fuel mixtures. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Spitfires that should have been grounded all winter flew combat patrols over the Arctic Circle, protecting convoys carrying supplies vital to the Soviet war effort. She turned next to altitude. By late war, Spitfires were operating above 35,000 feet, where the air was thin and unforgiving. At those heights, a fractionally incorrect fuel mixture could mean flooding, overheating, or catastrophic power loss. Shilling developed altitude-compensating carburetor modifications that improved engine output by 8% above 30,000 feet, a massive gain where every horsepower mattered. Her work saved lives again and again, quietly, methodically, without ceremony. At home, She kept her personal life separate from her work. She had married George Naylor in 1938, an aerodynamicist at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. When war broke out, Naylor volunteered for Bomber Command and flew Lancaster bombers with 625 Squadron. He completed 31 missions over Germany, surviving odds that killed nearly half of all bomber crewmen. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for flying beyond his required tour. She worried every time he flew. She knew the numbers. She never needed to be told how bad the odds were. They never discussed their work. He never asked about her projects. She never asked about his missions. War was compartmentalized. That was how you survived it. When time allowed, Shilling rode her Norton motorcycle through the English countryside. Racing had taught her how engines failed under stress, but riding gave her something else: clarity. At 90 miles an hour on empty roads, problems untangled themselves. Solutions emerged. Some of her best ideas came not in laboratories, but between hedgerows and open fields. By the end of the war, she had worked on 17 major engineering projects: carburetors, superchargers, cold weather systems, fuel optimization, high-altitude performance. Every project saved lives. Every project kept aircraft flying when they otherwise would not have. None ever matched the fame of the restrictor, and none needed to. When the war ended in 1945, the urgency faded. The Royal Aircraft Establishment shifted to peacetime research. Slower timelines, smaller budgets, less pressure. Shilling stayed. Engineering wasn't a job to her. It was who she was. In 1948, she received formal recognition. King George VI appointed her an Officer of the Order of the British Empire. She attended the ceremony at Buckingham Palace, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, and returned to Farnborough the next morning to continue her work. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that brilliance had nothing to do with gender. Beatrice Shilling spent another 21 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and long after the engines she saved fell silent, pilots still remembered the woman who gave them back their power. In 1.5 seconds that meant the difference between life and death. But the restrictor remained her legacy, the small brass washer that helped save the Royal Air Force when it mattered most. Beatrice Shilling remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969. 33 years of continuous service. 3 decades spent solving problems that kept pilots alive and aircraft flying. She never rose to the highest administrative ranks. Those positions were reserved for men, regardless of talent or achievement. The structure of the time simply did not allow women into director-level roles. Shilling accepted it without bitterness. She had no interest in paperwork or politics. She preferred engines, test benches, flight data, and real problems that demanded real solutions. Her value was never in titles. It was in results. After the war, her work shifted with the times. She contributed to the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first attempt at a ballistic missile, focusing on fuel delivery and high-altitude performance, problems strikingly similar to those she had solved in piston aircraft years earlier. She researched wet runway braking for early jet aircraft, after studies showed that landing accidents were killing more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. Water, rubber, friction, different variables, same physics. She published 3 technical papers on the subject. She even designed a bobsled. It seemed like an odd assignment for an aeronautical engineer, but bobsleds involved airflow, weight distribution, surface friction, and stability, problems Shilling had mastered over decades. The Royal Air Force Olympic team used her design in competition. They didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. To Shilling, that counted as success. She retired in 1969 at age 60. Retirement didn't slow her much. She restored vintage motorcycles, raced occasionally at classic events, and maintained the same Norton she had owned since 1934, the machine that had taught her how engines behaved under extreme stress, the machine that had shaped the way she thought. She never replaced it. She never needed to. Beatrice Shilling died on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81. She was survived by her husband, George, and by a lifetime of engineering achievements that quietly shaped the outcome of a world war. The obituaries focused on the restrictor, on Miss Shilling's orifice, the brass washer. Everything else became footnotes. But her legacy didn't fade. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Shilling. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum acquired her racing trophies and badges. In 2018, Winchester Heritage honored her as one of Hampshire's extraordinary women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Shilling Building for electronic engineering students. That same year, a plaque was unveiled near her birthplace, 110 years after she was born, and the restrictor itself became a teaching artifact. Engineering schools around the world studied it. A simple solution to a complex problem, implemented immediately under wartime pressure, with measurable, life-saving results. Some universities kept original restrictors in display cases, small brass washers behind glass. Quiet reminders that brilliance does not require complexity, only clarity, courage, and timing. Beatrice Shilling never commanded squadrons, never flew combat missions, never sought recognition. But in 1.5 seconds, the time it once took a Merlin engine to fail, she gave pilots back their power, their confidence, and their lives. And sometimes, that is how wars are won.